Do you think this basic attitude of Milton Erickson, like being as happy as he could be with all these physical problems, with all that happened, is based in utilization and his capability to deal with everything that happens right in that moment in the most positive way? Or how do you think did he manage to be such a positive and such an inspiring person by having all these problems at the same time?
Well, part of it, I think, was he was born into it. Remember that Erickson was born in a very small mining camp in Orem, Nevada in 1901. And the cabin that he was born into had a dirt floor. This is a dirt floor log cabin with 3 walls. The 4th wall was the mountain. So this is what he was born into. Now, the wagon train came once a month with supplies. So everything had to be utilized. If you had a piece of rope, you had to utilize it in 5 or 7 different ways. So he was born into a mentality of poverty where whatever happened, you utilized it. And however he conceptualized it for a therapy orientation, I can't say, but I think part of it was that this is who he was. And it was who he was as a father, who he was as a husband. He was consistently utilizing who he was as a man who was very physically impaired. He was very physically impaired. He was in a wheelchair when I met him, and very minimal use of his legs and more use of his left arm. But sometimes in order to write, he'd have to guide his right hand with his left hand. In order to eat, he might have to use his body to pull a spoon to his mouth. He was in constant chronic pain, but he was laughing all the time. And he would utilize the pain. He would say, I don't mind the pain. I don't like the alternative. And he would tell jokes about his pain. And so he was a living, breathing example of utilization. Now, most psychological problems are the opposite of utilization. Psychological problems could be defined as a failure to utilize. There's a resource that exists in the system, but it's not being utilized. And utilization is a philosophy of sufficiency. Whatever you have, you can utilize. And so Erickson lived utilization in a very coordinated way. So he was not speaking hypothetically or hypocritically that whatever you have, you can utilize. He was living it in the moment. So you were inspired by his utilizing the fact that he couldn't speak with false teeth. He had to relearn how to enunciate words clearly. He wasn't wearing false teeth in his mouth. And this was a man who had an actor's control of his voice. And he had to relearn how to speak, how to enunciate words. And he utilized that. So he transcended the moment as a living example. And he was one of those people who vindicated the planet by the fact that he was living it. He just was so completely inspiring that with so little, he did so much. He had so many physical problems.
So can you describe a little bit of these 2 sides? Yeah, these humble and utilization side, and the other side, which was, in my impression, much more strict, much more like having a clear understanding what seems to be right, and even going that far to more or less work with people without having a contracting before, like helping people when they got problems by taking a plane. There was one example you've been describing. Can you tell us a little bit about these 2 parts of Milton Erickson's persona?
Yeah, as I told you before we started, I'm now in the process of writing his biography, and he was a complex individual. Yes, he was very humble. We have a museum that's part of the Erickson Foundation, which is Erickson's home, the Erickson Historical Residence. And if you're in Phoenix, Arizona, and you make an appointment, you can see Erickson lived in a very humble way. His office was the size of a postage stamp. This is not the prestigious office of an internationally famous psychiatrist. It was a home. In the first home that Erikson had in Phoenix, where he lived from approximately 1947 to 1970, there were 3 bedrooms. The front bedroom for the boys, there was a bathroom, 1 bathroom in the house. The the middle bedroom for Dr. and Mrs. Erikson, which connected to the boys' bedroom. So you would have to go through Dr. Erikson's and Mrs. Erikson's bedroom to get to the boys' bedroom. There could have been 3 boys. There could have been 3 girls living in the house at the time. Erikson had 8 children, and it was 1 bathroom. Now, the entryway was a living room, and that was the waiting room for the patients. In the middle of the house, behind that was a dining room, which wasn't really used so much as a dining room because it was filled with papers, and the secretary was typing in that area. In back of that was a room, and if I said it was 3 meters by 3 meters, that would be an exaggeration. And that was Dr. Erikson's office. And so this is where hypnosis was invented from 1948 until 1970. And then there was a kitchen and a breakfast nook. So the patients interacted with the children. And the children would tell stories about the patients. They were instructed not to interact with the patients unless the patients indicated that they were interested. But there were some very strange patients, like one patient who was chewing pieces of paper and making them into spitballs and then putting them in different places on the furniture or under the furniture. And the family is cleaning this up after the patient leaves. So they learn to be very accepting of very unusual behavior. There was one story, because I visited that house with Milton Erickson, the first home, and that's now destroyed because it's become office area in Phoenix. And when I visited, it was the office for a residential treatment center. And Mrs. Erikson and I walked in, and she looked up at the ceiling and smiled. There was a broken ceiling tile. And that broken ceiling tile was created by a patient. So she told me the story. This was an alexithymic patient, a patient who couldn't express much emotion. And he was getting married. And he was so excited that when he came in to see Dr. Erikson, one of the children had a ball that was left on the floor, and exuberantly this man, who was not great at expressing emotion, picked up the ball, bounced it off of the floor. It broke a ceiling tile in the ceiling, and that was still there when Mrs. Erikson and I visited, which could have been 10 or 20 years later. And so there was a lot of very strange interactions. But when you were with Erikson, you were in a family situation, and the patients were some of them were almost integrated into the family, and that became a platform for them to strengthen themselves and then graduate and go out. And in some ways, I was similarly invited. Ernest Rossi certainly was invited and became a member of the Erikson family. And so it was it was a feeling of humility. And if you come to Phoenix and go to the museum, it's a very peaceful place, very humble. This is not ostentatious. It's just not beautiful Italian modern furniture. Erikson grew up in a very humble way on a farm in Wisconsin. After they moved and went in a covered wagon, they went east. Everybody was going west in these covered wagons. And Erikson's family, when his sister was born, and because the children needed to get an education, which couldn't happen in a mining camp in Nevada, they went back to where his mother had grown up in a farm in Wisconsin. And it was a very self-sustaining farm. The farm really didn't create income. It was meant to support the 9 children that Dr. Erikson's parents had. So everything was humble, and he really kept to that humility. But also, there was an iron fist under that velvet glove. He was a very strong human being, a dominating force interpersonally. So Erikson was always one up. in any conversation that he was in with Gregory Bateson or Mnuchin or whoever he interacted, Erikson was controlling, defining, inducing roles in the situation. But in the same sense of like a guru who was so present in the moment that he was learning even from being in a one-up position. So Erikson was a voracious learner. He never stopped learning, always was interested in improving himself, and had that dominating strength that he was going to be the best Milton Erickson that he could. And that made me want to be the best Jeff Zeig that I could be, because he was so congruent and working so assiduously with so little to be the best that he could.